Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to the history of architecture after 1850, or as I like to call it, the history of modern architecture. So we really start the beginning of our class with these first, 4 or 5 classes presenting these kind of late 19th century architecture movements that we call the historical revivals. And these famous historical revivals, we're basically taking architecture from, the ancient and medieval past and reviving them in their modern day to fit a new agenda, an agenda that didn't exist in the ancient past, right? They didn't have ancient Greek and Roman pagan temples. They had kind of moved on from Gothic churches, but they were reviving them again to suit new purposes, right? So in this case, neoclassical architecture is really the earliest of the historical revivals of the 19th century. And it's kind of a more architecturally accurate revival of classical architecture, right? That imperial architecture of the Greeks and Romans than even the Italian Renaissance ever was. But the real reason, while we're talking about these historical revivals is they were the modern architecture of their day, even though, they may not seem to belong in perhaps what you expected for this class. So these first 2 classes before test 1 will really serve primarily for you to kind of set the scene for our later classes when, we properly get into the things you would recognize as modern architecture. And just a hint, it kicks off earlier than you would think, at just the turn of the next century, in and around the year 1900. But it's these historical revivals we're going to talk about first that, the proper modern architects will be talking about soon. We're really trying to get away from specifically. So, to the modern architects at the turn of the century, these, garish regurgitations of the past really just aren't appropriate for a new age where we don't use, say, Greek temples in the modern day. So, they would say, why drag them out of the past like some adolescent who still drags around their childhood blankie? Why not invent a new architecture for our own age to suit the uses and aesthetics of our own age? So without further ado, let me set the world up, paint a picture, if you will, of the architectural scene before the rise of neoclassical architecture. So, with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 1700s, Europeans began to feel, kind of increasingly alienated from their architectural past. Large brick factories and other modern industrial infrastructures kind of devoured the countless medieval buildings and reorganized the ancient crowded streets and shanties of medieval towns into these kind of well-oiled machine cities based really around quick capital, based around quick money, quick production. So the few historic landmarks that survived in these European cities assumed these kind of new roles as, unique and unrepeatable works of a lost world out of which, future architects could kind of wring inspiration. So the new modern world in many European cities at the rise of the Industrial Revolution was this kind of unfamiliar place where, traditions were dying and this deeply unsettled people. The modern era kind of seemed ugly. It was this period of factories and steam engines. It seemed like, there was nothing beautiful about it to the revivalists. When they looked at the past, they saw the beautiful architecture of the medieval period and the ancient period and the Renaissance period, and the Baroque period, but when they looked around them, they didn't see beauty. They saw the industrial world of artless brick factories and mass-produced goods. This was now even a time where you could buy cheap goods for the first time, and the old system of, handicraft goods had been largely replaced. Whereas artists before had often learned through apprenticeship traditions of making things, but now things were being mass-produced by factories. It was this unsettling period. So the 1800s opened with Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire imposing the principles of the French Revolution on the rest of Europe by establishing new republics across Spain, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, and really, inspiring the rest to adopt their colonial and republican ideals. And so soon, the British Empire too began to kind of extend their colonial interests widely around the entire world. And as you can imagine, both empires began began to, look for and experiment with orders of architecture that best complemented their regimes as these kind of arguments in stone, right? So, the classical architecture of the ancient Greeks and Romans seemed at first the perfect candidate for both of them. It appeared, all at once to represent Europe, empire, republicanism, rationality, clarity, and utility, just as it had once done to the ancients and again to the 15th and 16th century Renaissance masters. And so we call this early 19th century revived passion for all things classical the Neoclassical movement. Alright, so let's go into a bit more detail here. So, the economic demands of these great new forming empires of Europe, always, if you can imagine, constantly at war with one another, with their colonies, they all kind of demanded this very quick assembly of new government buildings all the time in their colonies at home, and buildings that would communicate power and authority, right? And so, as you can imagine, unlike really anything else, the simple, classical temple forms of the ancient Greeks and Romans really excelled at this. And so all of a sudden you have, replicas of the Pantheon, the Propylaea, the Maison Curie, and the Parthenon soon kind of finding their way into the growing cities of France, England, Germany, Russia, and their colonies like the US to serve, new purposes which really did not exist in the ancient world, right? These temple forms taking on things like banks and government buildings. And it's not just government buildings, it's courtrooms, schools, colleges, hospitals, museums. I think I mentioned banks, and even sometimes prisons were increasingly, founded or refounded in this new neoclassical style. So, these institutions kind of came to take on these sort of Greco-Roman temple forms, obviously despite not being temples. And not only did this neoclassical movement emerge around the turn of the 1800s as this sort of reaction against the Industrial Revolution, as I said, but also really as a reaction against the very over-gaudy Baroque and Rococo styles that had sort of taken the European Renaissance and plasticized it or made it more maximalist, three-dimensional, and ornate. This had taken Europe by storm in the last century. And so the neoclassical movement then was an attempt to get back to the true simple classical aesthetics. So neoclassical architects looked to the architecture of only ancient Greece and Rome for inspiration, and just a little bit to the Renaissance masters, because many of these new democratic governments emerging in Europe and America at this time were kind of idealizing the ancient Greek democracies and the Roman Republic, as well as the late medieval and Renaissance republics in Italy, rising up just before and during the Renaissance. But neoclassical architects actually sought to kind of produce a more faithful reproduction of classical aesthetics, ancient Greek and Roman aesthetics, even than the Renaissance masters who sort of made things their own and mixed it with, traditional Christian architecture. Neoclassicists in the 1800s looked straight back to ancient Roman texts on architecture, for example, books by Vitruvius, and tried to absolutely replicate temple ruins down to the last detail on the skins of their buildings, more or less. So, these ancient Roman authors, these neoclassicists were reading about, believed that clarity, simplicity, proportion, unity, and tradition characterized good architectural design. So this was then both a stripping back of design, not unlike the later modernists, and a worshipping of tradition. Indeed, a worshipping of the oldest remembered architectural traditions of the West, or at least that was how those at the head of Europe's great empires saw it. And the legacy of neoclassical architecture can still be seen as one of the most extant around the Western world in Europe and its old colonies, and especially in the major downtowns of European and colonial American cities. And so, within the Neoclassical movement, there were, yes, many faithful reproductions of temples and other classical monuments, but, usually as follies and decorations, usually as monuments within a city. But most Neoclassical buildings kind of give themselves away because they really just consist of a sort of classical shell or skin around an 18th century, 19th century townhouse or other type of facility. Neoclassical buildings even weren't without the occasional Baroque and Renaissance flourish. So, typically you'd see Baroque elements around windows and very intensely on the interior. And you'd often find sort of Renaissance palace elements on first story foundation works. And so we'll see some examples of these soon as we tour some buildings. And so finally, just within this intro, just as a handy key, although, I'm not going to ask that you know this, just that you're able to recognize it in real life, Neoclassical architecture is really characterized, we might say, by this intense focus on symmetry. Typically close to 100% of Neoclassical buildings are symmetrical, meaning that the building can be bisected on one central axis and both sides would always be the same. Also, the outsides or facades are usually organized into this series of equal bays, meaning equal sizes for windows and for doors, which, notably you typically wouldn't find on Roman and Greek temples. Roman and Greek temples typically had no windows. And finally, the most important recognizable characteristics of Neoclassical buildings are their frequent columns, pediments, friezes, pilasters, urns, garlands, and rosettes that were, very regularly placed on the outside to give these buildings a sort of sense of grandness and monumentality. Though very characteristically of the age, many of these decorative carvings had really no meaning as they would in the ancient world. So this is something which obviously, sets apart ancient classical buildings from their neoclassical counterparts. They're using, a classical skin on a modern building, completely divorced from the needs and uses of the ancient world. So, a good example is the need to put windows on Roman temple forms. So let's get into our journey through some of the most iconic neoclassical buildings. And one of the earliest neoclassical architects to receive, wide recognition with the French Empire was Durand. And, his building philosophy was very much aligned with the early post-Napoleonic French Empire, who had just entered this very debtful post-war era, but were still looking to, redefine their image. So they desired cheap construction, mass production, and simplicity. And so for Durand, as the earliest successful pioneer of neoclassicism, he was really sought after by these post-Napoleonic French patrons, because he reduced all types and forms, classical types and forms, to a series of standardized parts that fit into a basic grid, meaning he simplified those, over-engineered Greek and Roman temples into these sort of squared off, standardized, mass-produced parts so that one could, cheaply sponsor a monument to the new empire or a government building. Durand famously did away with decoration unless it was absolutely necessary. He famously wrote that it is obvious that to please has never been the purpose of architecture. The well-being and maintenance of individuals and society is the aim. And this is very typical of, an architect in this sort of debtful post-Napoleonic War era. And so his Temple of Equality, which you see here, which he proposed early in his career in 1796, is actually a really good indicator of his design philosophy and sort of reflective of his times. So this temple, this monument, was a proposed monument to kind of embody the principles of the French Revolution in one building. It represents, a rejection of the aristocratic and royal ornamentation and excess of the Baroque and Rococo styles that preceded it, and it symbolized a rejection of the monarchy. The few friezes or carvings on it were meant to tell the story of the French people, including the revolution and transition to a world power. It was essentially a propaganda piece, a temple of equality, a monument to a France without the traditional monarchy. And so this temple was, in the end, intended to be this kind of sort of public space, like a forum used for, a number of events where citizens could theoretically come together to discuss and celebrate their shared values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, according to Durand. Unfortunately, this monument was never actually built. No patron ever took Durand up to pay for it, but I wanted to show it to you because it really represents the first stirrings of a desire to return to the simplicity of classicism, to remind onlookers that, while the over-gaudy Baroque and Rococo represented the old monarchy, New France could claim a new, no-nonsense style based on those ancient Republican Romans and democratic Greeks. Though Durand's cheap philosophy and expertise was for a time very valuable with those European nations looking to, redefine their image of their regimes in a debtful post-war era, Europe's governments very quickly bounced back with imperialism and had, no need for such cheap mass-produced monuments. The first of these was Frederick II, Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, who, with his newfound imperial funds, reorganized downtown Berlin into this gridded military parade ground, and he hired budding neoclassicist architect Karl Gotthard Langhans to design the main gate to it. And this gate served as a symbol of peace and as the entrance to the city of Berlin at large, fit for, military parades to enter and finish at, much like the function of a triumphal arch in the Roman Empire. And you can already tell the design of the gate draws very heavily on classical Greek and Roman architecture with its use of Doric columns, entablature, and a triumphal arch form. But above all, Langhans was heavily influenced by the famous Propylaea gateway in ancient Greek Athens. The ancient, ceremonial gateway to the Acropolis that he had studied during his travels. And so his gate, much like the Propylaea, boasted this 6-columned Doric portico flanked by these 2 Doric temple-style colonnaded rooms, which acted as guardhouses for the ceremonial guard force of Berlin. And notice how this is a perfect textbook showcase of neoclassical characteristics with, its simple, unadorned columns and pediment and its balanced, symmetrical design. And something I didn't mention before is that neoclassical architects love to reference classical mythology even though it had very little understanding or basis in their modern world. So, for example, on the top of this central gate we see a quadriga, this statue in short depicting the goddess Victory in a chariot pulled by 4 horses, this fitting image for Germany's recent rebrand as an imperial power. And so this gate was really the start of this new idea that Berlin saw itself as they called themselves, the new Athens on the River Spree. And sure enough, a largely neoclassical downtown Berlin slowly but surely began to emerge after just a few generations, and many buildings remain in place for you to see today, giving Berlin even today this sort of neoclassical gloss. And so Berlin had, after this gate, kind of completely rebranded themselves from this city of, wooden, half-timbered medieval buildings to a strong, imposing grid of stone neoclassical ones. And not long after Langhans' time, a new architect became famous in Germany as the most sought-after architect in Berlin, and this was Karl Schinkel. And, his education included traveling to Italy to reproduce every minimal detail of ancient buildings in, thousands of drawings. Then, for the next few decades of his life, he served as the most sought-after architect in Berlin, and he designed several buildings that would define Berlin's new neoclassical character. theater. And he didn't design buildings using Durand's universal grid, but his approach really unabashedly stuck to ancient authors' definitions of, what makes a good classical building, only now obviously taken out of its original context to serve the new buildings of Berlin. So here is the first really good example of his Berlin works, the New Wash in Berlin, and it was constructed as essentially a guardhouse for the royal guard, specifically for the headquarters of the guards of the nearby palace of the crown prince. And so, as you can imagine, this, kind of represents a break from the overly gaudy and maximalist Baroque and Rococo architecture that, at this time, would have been endemic all over Berlin. So, Schinkel's buildings would have been a sort of breath of fresh air in the city. And the design reflects, the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment with its new interest in symmetry and simplicity. And so, as you can see, Schinkel turned the guardhouse into a sort of temple, fronted by a temple front or a pediment held up by columns, within which you see sculptures broadcasting a nationalistic message of power and victory, much like the pediments of ancient Greek temples. At its center in this pediment you see the goddess of victory, Nike, and she's shown flanked by warrior gods and other deities symboling justice and strength. They're all holding symbols like swords or scales, reinforcing the values holding up this militaristic state. And it's these kinds of things that were very typical on temples dedicated to the gods of cities in ancient Greece, such as the Parthenon in Athens. Then in 1817, he built Berlin's first neoclassical theater, which would set down a model for the neoclassical as the appropriate form of theaters even to the modern day. And in 1822, he built Berlin's first museum at a time when, these imperial nations were first acquiring a lot of foreign architects and needed public places to display them. And so the Atlas Museum was built, of course, to complement Berlin's new neoclassical face with this iconic columned portico and a rotunda in the center modeled on the Pantheon in Rome, effectively, smushing together a Greek temple and a very recognizable Roman temple. And notice here the facade or outside is completely symmetrical with a central skylight in the dome to illuminate the entry foyer below. And the museum's collection, of course, reflecting historical interests of the time, was made up entirely of ancient Greek and Roman art, whose displays were arranged in chronological order. Leo von Klein's played a similar, very influential role as the top neoclassicist in Munich, just as Schinkel had played in Berlin, but he was the first to really blend Renaissance styles together with Orthodox classicism, and this is a trend that would become popular with neoclassical buildings later on. And so, Klein's as well had toured antiquities in Italy, becoming an artist of sorts, again copying classical ruins and Renaissance buildings down as drawings to come back inspired. And so he began creating very buildings for state institutions in Munich, which broadcast that remembered feeling of power, efficiency, and grandeur lost since the Renaissance. So, for instance, he redesigned the Royal Palace in Munich and based it heavily, even almost copied it from the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, a Renaissance-era palace. And, this new building continued to house the Bavarian kings, queens, and their families and courtiers as it had since the 1500s. But this new palace, of course, included things in fashion for 19th century monarchs. It included an antiquarium, which is a sort of museum, private museum, a royal ballroom, several lush gardens and courtyards, and of course a modern Baroque theater. But the new palace on the outside wasn't simply a copy of the Palazzo Pitti either, although it was on one side, but overall it was a blend of all of the classical movements: Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, and Neoclassicism. So for instance, on the other side of the building, you have this neoclassical double-stacked arch facade with piers and columns, structurally much like a Roman aqueduct or the side of the Colosseum, only ornamented with these overly ornate Baroque statuary and flourishes, while on the inside of the palace, The Rococo, still in very good taste for European monarchs, covered most every room in the form of golden foliage, carvings, and overly ornate wallpapers. So even early in the 19th century, Neoclassicism was still only very fashionable on the outside of buildings. It had not been formulated as a decoration scheme for the inside, nor would it really ever outside of perhaps North America. Further north, Britain, quickly emerging as the world's largest empire, was relatively a latecomer to adopting Neoclassicism, and so had all the while no really unified public architecture with which to, push its imperial agenda, while all of these other European countries on the continent were experimenting with Neoclassicism early on. And it wasn't until around the turn of the 1800s that rich patrons in London, Dublin, and Edinburgh finally gave into the trend and began to commission neoclassic buildings. So new universities, museums, and government buildings began to give a new face to the British Empire. And William Chambers was really the earliest pioneer of this style in 1776 when he designed the Somerset House in London. This was a huge complex of government offices situated on the River Thames. Now, quickly, for some historical context, since the middle of the 1700s, there had been, great growing criticism that London had no great public buildings. Government departments and other learned societies still huddled together in, small, old, unremarkable medieval or Tudor buildings, really undistinguishable from the rest of the city. Nothing to sort of make them grandiose. And so developing national pride as England's empire grew made this very apparent and embarrassing, and England too sought to clear away their unremarkable government buildings of old and build works of beauty and efficiency to replace them. And so the Somerset House killed many birds with one stone by consolidating several government offices once situated in Tudor buildings far and wide throughout London into one place. And so now, all in one place, you could find the tax office, the stamp office, the salt office, the lottery office, and even the sewage office and more. And the new building boasted a new style too. It imitated those French experiments in Neoclassicism with a Pantheon-like temple front and a round Pantheon-like dome behind, though now with wings spreading out to the side in imitation of the Louvre Palace in Paris with those large featureless courtyards, now only with a Renaissance style as opposed to a Baroque one. So essentially, the Somerset House combined the Pantheon with the Louvre. Notice though the showcase pillars of Neoclassicism here. The building appears completely symmetrical on the outside with a centrally placed temple front, and as a bonus, the featureless courtyards in front with these central fountains kind of recalled the ancient Roman forums. Another very early British experimenter of Neoclassicism was Robert Adam, who happened to be William Chambers' chief rival. Now, Adam had studied for years in Rome under French neoclassicists, so his creations were a bit more innovative. He created, new original styles by combining and loosely imitating several classical buildings rather than fully copying classical forms like a wannabe ancient Roman architect, which was then of course the norm. So here on his estate house at Kettleston, he united a triumphal arch inspired by the Arch of Constantine with a hemispherical dome inspired by the Pantheon. And he even went so far as to create the first neoclassical interiors, not by placing external classical details on the interior as we did in America, but by copying the interiors of classical buildings of ancient Rome itself. So here, for inspiration, he looked at those sumptuously painted and furnished interiors from Pompeii and Herculaneum, these ancient Roman cities once covered by volcanic ash in 72 AD and only recently rediscovered and excavated in 1748. So because of its complete faithfulness to classicism on the inside and out, this country house, designed for a wealthy landowner and member of parliament, is considered one of the finest neoclassical examples in England. Entering the house, you are immediately astounded by the marble hall. This hall was designed to suggest the Roman atrium of a Roman domus or Roman house. Traditionally, the open courtyard in the front hall of a Roman house to greet and do business with visitors. And notice, like a Roman atrium, it's made to resemble an open-roofed courtyard, even though it must be roofed in rainy England, but retains, some semblance with the round oculus or the skylight at the top, letting in, copious amounts of sunlight. And the niches in this wall, much like in a Roman domus, contain classical statuary in these kind of apse conches. Though a domus would typically have featured busts of their ancestors, the marble hall has reproductions of famous classical statues. And if the marble hall symbolizes the atrium of a Roman villa, the adjoining saloon, as Adam called it, symbolizes the vestibulum, or the sheltered courtyard around which the inner family rooms radiate, within which the family congregates in private. And so a Roman vestibulum often traditionally has at its center this lush garden. So while the atrium in the front, with an adjoining office was often the domain of the outward-looking, business-oriented men of the house, the vestibulum was traditionally the domain of the inward-looking, oriented women of the house, in charge of cooking, raising children, and other household duties best kept separate and back from business life. Only extremely close family friends were allowed back here. But since Robert Adams' clients had servants traditionally kept separate from the family, his vestibulum kind of served more as a showpiece and party room, but its use as a central node to the rest of the rooms in the house was preserved. And rather unlike a Roman domus, it is underneath not an open courtyard, but a Pantheon-inspired dome, taking a round shape, which is skylit by this giant glass oculus because, again, of England's rainy weather. Lower down, the interior walls were, modeled after the Roman temples of the ancient Roman Forum, and doubled as another sculpture gallery for ancient art as in the atrium. So you can see, as a typical neoclassicist, Adam is kind of cobbling together the structures and aesthetics of ancient Rome to create something new to suit an 18th century way of living. And this is so typical of neoclassicism and historical revivals in general. They are using ancient forms, but they must be completely divorced from their original use and meanings because the way of living has changed. They are essentially forcing ancient forms to fit in new contexts. They're trying to put square peg in a round hole, as the later modernist architects would say. And so this fitting a classical peg in an 18th century world can be seen around the vast estate of Adam's client, not just the house. So Adam also designed numerous functionless temples, fake ruins, Roman gatehouses without walls, and miniature Roman bridges over tiny streams, and a whole number of other follies around the gardens and fields of this estate, many of which were never built, but those that were include the North Lodge, this kind of guest house awkwardly taking the form of a triumphal arch, and the fishing room and boathouse awkwardly, mimicking an ancient Roman bathhouse in miniature. And as Neoclassicism gained popularity in the British Isles, at Edinburgh the trend began as Orthodox classicism, and architects inspired to, studiously replicate ancient Greek buildings from Athens. So a great example of this is at Calton Hill, which was transformed into the Acropolis as a partial reconstruction of the Parthenon ruins. But again, in typical neoclassic fashion, it didn't serve as a temple complex or even a religious purpose, but as a monument to celebrate the British victory over Napoleon. And so again, we're trying to use the monumentality of the ancients here to serve modern agendas. But it was out from this point that Edinburgh would become one of the most neoclassical cities in Europe and the most neoclassical city in Scotland. And so this began in 1825 when Thomas Hamilton added to the bottom of the hill Royal High School, built as a platform crowned with Doric temples inside which the classrooms and facilities could be found. The next generation of neoclassical architects designed the astoundingly imposing British Museum in London, and in typical neoclassical style, it is perfectly symmetrical with a centerpiece temple front. Indeed, the pediment has sculptures inside depicting the birth of Athena, making it a direct copy of the pediment of the Parthenon, but having little to do with the patrons or the British Museum except perhaps its historical value. The National Gallery in London belongs to this era as well. Again, a perfectly symmetrical building with a central temple front topped by a round dome, and here, like in the British Museum, the facade is stripped bare of unnecessary sculptures and motifs, just like a Roman temple, making, again, a stark break from the Baroque and Rococo. But you'll notice this building continues to put a classical skin on what is an otherwise very 19th century building. There were no buildings in ancient Greece or Rome shaped like this, and none with that characteristically square grid of windows, so common in the Baroque age that all neoclassical buildings seem to feature, usually separated by pilasters. Across the Atlantic Ocean during the colonial period, Americans mostly lacked trained architects until, again, around 1800, when professionals who looked to the French for inspiration began to work in Boston and Philadelphia. And so this fledgling nation was soon constructed with some of the most striking and unified neoclassical landscapes in the world as they filled out their empty cities. After all, not having the burden of clearing away medieval architecture. This was best showcased by America's new capital, Washington, D.C., where Pierre Charles L'Enfant planned the new streets before the buildings were built. And neoclassical architects, time and time again, won competitions to implement their designs into important buildings like the Capitol Building and the White House. So Charles Bulfinch was really one of the first to establish neoclassicism in America after the Revolutionary War. The style wouldn't really be seen until the United States properly became a nation, and I'll show you what this looked like in just a second before neoclassicism took on the popular form for government buildings. But in 1787, he famously opened the Massachusetts State House in Boston, really one of the first neoclassical buildings in America, which imitated Chapter's Somerset House back in England, though on a much smaller scale, obviously, and built from, a much poorer mix of materials reflective of the upstart nation, mostly built in brick and wood, as opposed to the marble and stone back in London. And on top, he even placed a cheap wooden dome, the best Boston could afford at the time, first painted in gray, then gilded in copper to kind of hide the fact that it was wood, and finally gilded in gold. But before the current State House was completed in 1798, Massachusetts' old government house was the Old State House, fittingly on what is now Washington Street, this amazing survival. And this is just a really good indication of what American public buildings looked like before the neoclassical came in and became the new standard. They were really kind of inspired by the austere Protestant churches they knew back in Europe, especially because the first government meetings in American colonies were held in churches, and so the iconography of a government building and a church kind of became the same to them. So, from here, looking at it against the new State House, you can see the progression to a more, academic and conscious attention to symmetry, equal proportion, clarity of form, and not just this fanciful and unintentional mindless post-Renaissance decor, but this newfound classical archaeological awareness with which, these neoclassical architects came to reference in their buildings. And inside the new State House, as I said before, America began to sort of shy away from the Baroque and the Rococo as on other neoclassical buildings in Europe, and developed for themselves this neoclassical decoration scheme for the interior by simply miniaturizing the exterior features instead of what Robert Adam was doing, which was actually copying the interior of ancient Roman houses. So on the inside of these American government buildings, you can usually expect to see a number of neoclassical design features you would normally see on the outside of ancient Greek and Roman temples, including, pilasters, decorative carvings, and overhanging cornices, sometimes interspersed with, these ornate canvas paintings telling the story of the United States. Meanwhile, Henry Latrobe brought to Neoclassicism this idea of professionalism and trust when he designed the Bank of Pennsylvania in 1780 with this iconic temple front porch at both ends. He essentially established the temple type as the appropriate form of American banks. Unfortunately, this bank was demolished in the early 20th century, and only a few drawings and photographs of the building survive today. But this lost masterpiece was the first bank in America to use impenetrable materials, stone and marble, and it even boasted the first stone dome in the United States. And so, if you can imagine, in colonial Pennsylvania, this was very out of place, but all the better. It was this powerful symbol, a temple to money. Banks before in America were often plain and unassuming, often operating out of private homes, taverns, or merchant shops. But this new building was modeled in shape almost exactly after a Roman imperial temple, with a portico in the front and largely featureless sides, which offered obviously very little opportunity to break in except through the front. And so this simple yet imposing form provided this timeless and trustworthy appearance, right? Ancient Roman architecture obviously communicated power, wealth, no nonsense, and strength, this perfect image for a new bank. It was designed to create, this sense of grandeur and importance in the town that drew everyone's admiration, and its imposing stone facade captured everyone's trust. So, in America, we would build temples not to gods, but to money. And it wasn't long before every new American bank just about hopped on this trend. Latrobe then broke his own record with his project for Baltimore Cathedral, the first Roman Catholic cathedral in the US in 1818, with a much larger 21-meter dome and massively upscaled temple front. The dome was covered on the interior with an oculus in the center, much like, again, the Pantheon in Rome. And most of the first American bishops were consecrated here to fill the ever-multiplying diocese, and until recent years, more US priests were ordained here than anywhere else. And so the new cathedral is this monumental neoclassical style building designed in conformity to a Latin cross basilica plan. But this is a departure from previous Protestant American church architecture, which often just took the form of a simple hall and bell tower. But this first Catholic cathedral was, despite having a neoclassical skin, it was in keeping with, long-standing European traditions of cathedral design by taking the Latin cross church plan like many historical Catholic churches. But the plan does distinguish itself from European cathedral design across the ocean by uniting three distinct historical elements: a Roman temple front, which you typically don't see, a Pantheon-like dome, and a longitudinal, of course, Latin cross basilica plan complete with a westwork, very common on Catholic buildings since the 11th century. And so since it is referencing, long-standing Christian church layouts, it is, even though built in this relatively modern neoclassical style, marking itself out as a Catholic church to set itself apart from the many, many Protestant churches in the city, also being built for the first time in the neoclassical style here too. On the inside, Latrobe created these classically detailed hemispheres which will remind you of the Pantheon in Rome. So, grids of these plaster rosettes adorn its round coffered ceiling, just like the Pantheon. And just below, the entire interior was lit with these gigantic ground level windows, which was in striking contrast to, the traditional dark cavernous recesses of Gothic cathedrals and Romanesque cathedrals with their windows very high up. This was, in a sense, taking a page out of the book of Europe and America's well-lit Protestant churches, but also, the preference for this bright whiteness all over the inside of the church here was very representative of certain Catholics in America finally adopting Enlightenment era values, prioritizing things like, science and liberty and social progress, rejecting superstition, right? Intellectual advancements that the Protestants had made, but that the Catholics had kind of lagged behind on. And just more simply, this brightness was reflective of America's optimism toward the future, this kind of optimistic style gleaned from America's new government buildings. And you'll notice here again, like the government buildings, is a great example of, bringing the exterior simplicity of Neoclassicism into the interior. But no one cared about developing America's architecture as much as Thomas Jefferson. And understandably, Thomas Jefferson's interest in building the architecture of the new Republic of the US peaked while he served as ambassador to France, because he was exposed to so much of it as a representation of the new liberated French nation. He even claims to have been brought to tears by gazing upon the Maison Curie, a Roman period temple in France, for hours. And so, with his return to the US, he designed a model based on this temple to serve as the Virginia state capital in 1785. For context, let's quickly look at the old Virginia state capitol. So, while the first legislative body of Virginia convened at the Jamestown Church, they relocated to Williamsburg and built themselves a new capital by 1705. And you can see its reconstruction here. You can see it's this rather simplified colonial Protestant vernacular style with almost no, neoclassical influences. But after the Revolutionary War, Jefferson urged the capital to be moved to Richmond. And you'll see he's copied his favorite Roman temple in Nîmes very closely, only blown it up to fit offices, used Ionic columns, this different column type, and added windows. And so really quite awkwardly took the form of an ancient pagan temple and moved in an 18th century government. And this is regarded as the first neoclassical temple-style building in the United States. And so this trend of designing capitol buildings to accurately copy ancient temples was established. It was executed, for example, arguably better at the Vermont State House in the 1830s, which based theirs off of the Greek temple of Hephaestus in Athens. But Jefferson's final and best well-known architectural project was the academical village of the University of Virginia, the style of which would thereafter become this widely emulated architectural model of secular education, of college buildings, university buildings. And here he started with this half-scale Pantheon replica at the head of this grassy field, flanked by these colonnaded pavilions, these classrooms. And the Pantheon-like rotunda housed the library and these cloister-like appendages for the college students to study. Right, so this Pantheon-like rotunda, this library, was meant to sort of evoke a temple to education, just as the Pantheon in Rome was a temple to all the gods. And the 5 pavilions on either side of this great central lawn served on the second stories as the professors' residences, while the first stories served as their classrooms. Meanwhile, the students lived in dorms that framed this great hill on which this brilliant neoclassical campus was centered. And as Thomas Jefferson was probably the biggest fan in America of neoclassical architecture, each pavilion actually showcased a different style of classical architecture by boasting, different variations of the classical orders. And so, in the end, Thomas Jefferson designed his academical village in Virginia to sort of be a model for higher education in America, where the students and faculty could live and work in a very harmonious and inspiring environment, recalling, the same sort of environments that inspired the philosophy and intellectuality of ancient Greece and ancient Rome.